We now have full details regarding a disturbing case of child torture out of Crow Wing County, Minnesota. This is near Crosslake, north of Brainerd, Minnesota. 32-year-old Jordan Nicole Borders has been charged with 3 felony counts of torture of a child and 3 counts of felony engages in stalking. Reading from the criminal complaint, quote, an investigator began investigating a child maltreatment case involving 3 individual children and their mother, Jordan Borders, the defendant herein. At all times relevant to this proceeding, the defendant and 3 minor children resided at a residence located in Crow Wing County. Around mid-March 2022, one of the children, Child 2, who is 9 years old, was seen at the Children's Hospital with the concern of his hemoglobin numbers dropping. The child was monitored with the only explanation of his numbers dropping is that someone was removing blood from his body. Borders said that the hospital lab was removing too much blood from the child. However, during a forensic interview on November 21st, the 3 children disclosed they have observed Borders withdraw blood from Child 2 frequently before doctor's visits where he was being tested. The children furthermore disclosed that they were directed by Borders to then flush the blood down the toilet and were told by Borders not to say anything. This investigation also revealed the other 2 children, 11 and 8, were self-diagnosed by Borders as having brittle bone disease and forced to wear casts and neck braces even though they didn't have any injuries. Child 1 said he has observed Borders steal casting supplies from the hospital, and then she would put her own casts on him. A medical review was conducted on Child 1, which showed he had been in a cast for 796 days, or around 2 years, and 2 months of his life. Investigations further revealed the Borders was receiving proceeds from the state of Minnesota to care for Child 2 and had been nominated to receive several gifts and money from several nonprofit foundations in the area. The total amount received from appears to be in excess of $35,000. During a forensic interview on November 21st of 2022, the children made similar consistent disclosures regarding the torture inflicted upon them by the defendant. Child 1 reported the following. The defendant would choke all 3 children and throw them across the house. The defendant threatened Child 1 with a hammer, and she actually threw it at him. Defendant would make them all stand outside in just underwear for a long time. The defendant would make them stay in their rooms unless she wanted something. Then they would come out and do something for her. They had to clean the house, do the dishes, laundry, etc. On one occasion, the defendant asked Child 1 to get something, and he didn't hear her. The defendant then got up to see what he was doing, and he was reading a book. The defendant picked Child 1 up by his throat and held him against the wall. Child 1 stated his feet were high up. He couldn't breathe at all. He couldn't breathe any air in or air out, and he couldn't talk. His vision was blurry. Child 1 said he doesn't know why she let go, but she just threw him. The back of the head hit the wall. It hurt really bad. Child 2 and 3 were in their rooms when this happened. After she choked him, the defendant told him to get back to his room. The defendant then went to get the thing she wanted and sat back down to watch TV. Child 1 further reported the defendant would make the children go outside in the cold for long periods of time, and his whole body would be burning. The defendant was hit with a spoon, leaving marks, hit him with charging cords and with a belt with things on it. The defendant would hit him with a charging cord. It would then make him bleed. The defendant also made Child 1 tell people that Child 2 couldn't walk. When they went to the doctor, the defendant would make Child 1 cough when he didn't have a cough because he had asthma, but now he knows he really didn't have asthma. Child 1 would get asthma medication, but he didn't need it. Sometimes his dad would use it. Additionally, the defendant would tell him to puke at the doctor's, even though he didn't need to. The defendant would make Child 1 pretend that he broke his bones. The defendant would take casting supplies and syringes from doctor's offices, including from an orthopedics, and then she would then put fake casts on him. If the children didn't do what they were told, they got beaten by the defendant. Child 2 disclosed as follows. The defendant choked all 3 children against the wall, hit them with belts, charger cords, anything hard. The defendant would tell them he could come out of his room and he would chase him around and hit him with a spoon. Child 2 said he got really sick and had to go to the hospital, and the defendant kept drawing my blood and blood and blood. She kept doing it and don't tell anyone. Child 2 reported the defendant drew his blood with a syringe from his arm and PICC line. The defendant kept doing this, causing Child 2's hemoglobin to deplete. Child 2 said this made his body feel sick, sleepy. The defendant choked them with her hands and would drop them to the ground. Child 2 said his head hurt, and when the defendant did this, his feet were off the ground. The defendant would hit him everywhere with charger cords and belts with his clothes on and off. The defendant made the children go outside in the winter. Child 2 said he was super cold and his legs and feet were burning. He doesn't know why they had to go outside. When asked about a typical day living with the defendant, Child 2 stated, "I was never safe." Child 2 said his body felt hungry when he was being fed through a PICC line, which was not medically necessary. Child 2 further described that his body felt sad and his body growls. Child 2 tried to sneak food into his room, but the defendant and Child 2's father would search it. One time when Child 2 snuck food in his room when he was really hungry, the defendant and his dad searched his room, and after they found what they were looking for, he got a lot of spankings. Child 2 also reported he had to sleep on the floor with no clothes on. He never had a bed. Child 3 reported the following. She was at the FAC Center to talk about how the defendant was doing mean things to her and her brothers. The defendant would tell the children she was going to kill them. When the defendant said that Child 3 said she thought she might die, the defendant said to Child 2, the most defendant would bring Child 2 in his room sometimes, and Child 3 would just hear screaming. Child 3 also reported the defendant choked all 3 of the kids in their rooms if they weren't clean enough. When the defendant would do this to Child 3, she could barely breathe and felt like she was going to pass out. Child 3 said her head would start hurting, starts to race, and she wouldn't be able to walk right. Her vision was blurry. Her breathing was not so good, and she coughed a lot after. The defendant would tell Child 3 not to cough or cry, and she would do it again. Child 3 reported that when the defendant choked Child 2, Child 2 would be off the ground and kicking his feet, but the defendant wouldn't stop. Child 3 also reported that on one occasion, the defendant busted Child 2's head open and it was bleeding. And the defendant told the teacher that Child 2 did it against the corner of the wall, but that wasn't what really happened. The defendant would not allow Child 2 to walk when the children's father was home and was required to stay in his wheelchair, but that Child 2 was allowed to walk when their father wasn't home. Child 3 said that if Dad knew Child 2 could walk, he would know the defendant was lying. Child 3 also reported the defendant would tell Child 2 to say bad words to their father so that he would hit Child 2. Other times the defendant would tell Child 3 to bite her so she could show the mark to her father, and the defendant would tell them that Child 2 bit her. So Child 2 would get in trouble with their father. The defendant always wanted Child 2 to get in trouble. Finally, Child 3 stated that on days that Child 2 had doctor appointments, Child 3 would watch the defendant use a syringe to take blood from Child 2. Usually on Mondays, the defendant would put the blood in a cup, and one of the 3 children would then be required to flush it down the toilet. On July 15th of 2022, a search warrant was executed at Borders residence, 33249 Industrial Road, Crosslake, Crow Wing County, Minnesota, during which time evidence such as syringes and casting materials were located. Unquote. That was directly from the criminal complaint. Again, Jordan Nicole Borders facing 3 counts of torture of a child and 3 counts of felony engages in stalking. I'm Neil Carlson reporting for iNewZ.TV.